Members will now move to file item 52. Senator Mitchell.
Mr. Secretary, please read.
Senate Bill 443 by Senator Mitchell, an act relating to forfeiture.
Senator Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Colleagues, I know we have a long agenda today, and I'm, along with you, have tried to be very brief in my statements. I'm going to take a little longer than I normally do on this one, only because so many members have asked specific questions about this issue, and so I want to try to cover all of them in my statement, so I hope that you will indulge me. Again, I'm presenting Senate Bill 443, a bill to protect California property owners from abuses in civil asset forfeiture and to ensure that law enforcement engaging in civil asset forfeiture is subject to California state laws. This is a multi-pronged approach to a problem which has reached epic proportions in many California communities, requiring that in most cases a defendant be convicted of an underlying crime before cash or property can be permanently seized. It will require that more drug asset forfeiture cases be handled under state law rather than transferred to federal courts in order to ensure the stricter standards under California current law are followed. Frankly, colleagues, I have been blown away at some of the stories and statistics I've read concerning the practice of civil asset forfeiture. Stories that have run in the Orange County Register, the Press Enterprise, the Washington Post, just as recent as today, as well as other periodicals across the state and nation. The idea that law enforcement can permanently seize a person's assets with no conviction, with the onus on the accused person to prove their own innocence, has been shocking. The calls to address this problem have been from both sides of the aisle and from officials at both the state and federal level. Case in point. National bipartisan call for reform. A national bipartisan consensus has emerged for an end to equitable sharing. On January 9th, 2015, the Republican chairs of both the U.S. Senate and House Judiciary Committees wrote to former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder asking that the U.S. Department of Justice end the practice. They wrote, permission to read, Madam President?
Without objection.
Thank you. And they wrote, quote, "We are concerned that these seizures might circumvent state forfeiture restrictions, create improper incentives on the part of state and local law enforcement, and unnecessarily burden our federal authorities." On the 16th, former Attorney General Holder announced new guidelines to limit equitable sharing, in addition to the concerns raised by Congress. The U.S. Department of Justice decision follows hard on the heels of a Washington Post investigation called Stop and Seize that found that since 2011, police have made cash seizures worth more than $2.5 billion from motorists and others without first obtaining search warrants or indictments. In California alone, colleagues, in the 8-year period between 2000 and 2008, California law enforcement entities seized over 300 million, the paper is here someplace, $300 million in assets. Again, a recent editorial by former U.S. Department of Justice officials appointed during the Reagan administration wrote, again, permission to read?
Without objection.
Quote, "As two people who were heavily involved in the creation of the asset forfeiture initiative at the Justice Department in the 80s, we find it particularly painful to watch as the heavy hand of government goes amok. The program began with good intentions, but now, having failed in both purpose and execution, it should be abolished," end quote. Unfortunately, the U.S. Department of Justice decision to limit equitable sharing is not a permanent statutory change and can be reversed by a subsequent administration. Therefore, states must provide durable protections through legislative reform. Hence, the bill I'm bringing before you today. What this bill specifically will do: it addresses the issue of equitable sharing with the federal government, which results in California cases not adhering to California laws. It increases protections for California property owners by requiring a conviction if property is to be taken permanently. It gives people who have had property seized the right to an attorney. The right to an attorney is currently guaranteed under criminal law, not so under civil law. It allows for recovery of attorney's fees if the person is found innocent of the crime they were accused of. It also shifts the onus from the person having to prove their innocence to law enforcement to prove guilt. It increases transparency. Current law requires the Attorney General to issue a yearly report, which this bill builds upon to include the number of cases initiated under state law versus those involving the feds, the number of suspects charged with crimes, the disposition of the cases, i.e. if no charges were filed, if the charges were dropped, a plea deal, acquittal, etc. It adjusts the distribution of seized funds in such a way as to take the incentive off the table for local law enforcement to focus an excessive amount of its energy on asset forfeiture. Simply, members, SB 443 reestablishes the most basic tenets of California constitutional law and values and ensures that California state law is being adhered to. Amendments were taken in the Appropriations Committee to restore funding for the ethics training relative to asset forfeiture. Again, under the current practice, the distribution of forfeiture proceeds go according to this percentage breakdown. 65% of asset forfeiture proceeds are distributed to law enforcement, 10% to the prosecuting agency, 24% to the general fund, and 1% for training of prosecutors on asset forfeiture. And according to the annual Attorney General's report, most counties give that money to the California District Attorneys Association. Because this bill could result in increased court time in forfeiture actions and would require additional indigent defense resources, this bill would reallocate the proceeds from forfeitures to ensure that courts and court-appointed counsel receive additional funds to cover their increased costs. Therefore, this bill would have a distribution formula that looks like this: 54% to local law enforcement, 24% to the general fund, which is no change, 10% to the courts, 5% to prosecutors and 5% to defenders, and 2% for ethics training for asset forfeiture practices. Again, those are the amendments we took in appropriations. I ask for your support for this very critical policy change, which will allow law enforcement across the state of California to focus on California's state law versus expanding and extending their power in accordance with what the federal government will allow.
Thank you, Senator Mitchell. Debate or discussion? Senator Stone.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and members of the Senate. When this bill first came before the Public Safety Committee, I voted no. But my no vote was based on some concerns that my esteemed colleague from Los Angeles has appropriately addressed through amendments that were adopted by the Appropriations Committee. With that said, I stand here today to ask members to join me in supporting SB 433 as written today. And with the amendments adopted by the Appropriations Committee, this makes this bill a good bill. It is a fair bill. This bill basically says that the government cannot seize the property of innocent people. Asset forfeiture is an important tool for law enforcement, and I strongly believe that the guilty should be subjected to forfeiting their assets gained by illegal means. At the same time, however, the government should not be able to permanently seize property of people that are suspected of committing a crime. Take the following example. A person who is suspected of being a criminal has their house searched. They find $10,000 in cash. The $10,000 in cash is seized because the alleged criminal is involved in the illicit drug industry. That person goes through the justice system and ultimately is found not guilty in any criminal behavior. Why should the $10,000 in cash that was seized under asset forfeiture not be returned to the person? Well, the reason why it isn't returned is because the public safety agencies that were the beneficiaries of asset forfeiture had already gone through the money, and there was no money to return to the innocent victim, which is just wrong. This bill is simple. This bill is clear. The property of people who are found not guilty of criminal behavior should not have their property returned to them, or should have their property returned to them. And this bill simply allows for innocent people to get their property back if they are not convicted of a criminal activity. And I want to thank again the author for her hard work on this measure, and I respectfully request you all vote aye on this important bill.
Thank you, Senator Stone. Senator Morrell.
Thank you, Mr. President. And members, when it comes to drug dealers, I'm really hardcore and think they should be punished severely, as well as forfeiture. But I think this is what we've done today or what our law has done, they've gone perhaps too far. Even the Heritage Institute has come out and said did a study on this nationwide, said we need to pull back some of these things, because there's another aspect of this. Even a landlord who owns an apartment building with 20 units or 100 units, and perhaps he's out of state and he rents to somebody and they're busted for drugs, properties like that have actually been seized from totally innocent, neutral third parties. So I am supportive of this bill, and thank you to the author for it. And I ask for an aye vote.
Thank you, Senator Morrell. Members, any further debate or discussion? Seeing none, Senator Mitchell, would you like to close?
I would, Mr. President. Thank you very much. And I'm only going to close because I sort of flubbed the additional statistic that was most poignant that I wanted to make sure members heard. Again, I said to you that the Attorney General reports on the amount of money through the equitable sharing kind of federal law loophole that California law enforcement organizations collect. And again, between 2000 and 2008, $305 million was seized. And another important fact for us all to understand that in 2000, our colleagues here in the California legislature voted to forbid state and local agencies from using the federal equitable sharing loophole, except in limited circumstances. Unfortunately, then Governor Gray Davis vetoed the measure. I think since 2000, clearly the entire nation is coming to grips with what equitable sharing has done in terms of private citizens and the protection of their assets. And with that, I ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Senator Mitchell. Secretary, please call the roll.
Allen. Aye. Anderson. Aye. Bates. Aye. Bell. Aye. Berryhill. Block. Aye. Canella. Aye. De Leon. Aye. Fuller. Aye. Gaines.
Aye.
Aye. Galgiani. Aye. Glazer. Aye. Hall. Aye. Hancock. Aye. Hernandez. Aye. Hertzberg. Aye. Hill. Aye. Hueso. Aye. Huff. Aye. Jackson. Aye. Lara. Leno. Aye. Leyva. Liu. Aye. McGuire. Aye. Mendoza. Aye. Mitchell. Aye. Monning. Aye. Morlock. Aye. Morrell. Aye. Wynn. Aye. Nielsen. Pan. Aye. Pavley. Aye. Roth. Aye. Runner. Aye. Stone. Aye. Vidak. Aye. Wachowski. Aye. Wolk. Wolk, aye.
Secretary, please call the absent members.
Berryhill. Aye. Lada. Aye. Leyva. No. Nielsen.
Ayes 38, noes 1. Measure passes.